My vegan daughter protested at the steakhouse where I work, so I served her steak for dinner. Megan stood outside my workplace with a giant sign, "My dad murders animals here." 20 customers watched my 17-year-old daughter scream about animal cruelty while filming herself. "He brings home dead flesh. He profits from suffering." Several families left mid-meal. My manager yanked me into his office. "Control your kid, or you're fired." 6 months ago, Megan went vegan and made it everyone's problem. We accommodated everything: vegan dinners twice weekly, separate groceries, even bought her a mini fridge because she wouldn't store food near our corpse meat. But my job at the steakhouse? Unforgivable. I've worked there 10 years. It pays our mortgage, her college fund, her vegan groceries. Didn't matter. "You almost cost me my job," I told her at home. "Good. Maybe you'll find ethical work. This job pays for your food, your clothes, everything." She rolled her eyes. I never asked to be born into a murder family. That night was our scheduled vegan dinner. Megan came down excited, like nothing happened. 3 ribeye steaks sat on the table. "What is this?" "Dinner. It's vegan night." "Not anymore. You protested my job? You eat what my job provides. This is abuse." "No, this is consequence." My wife stayed silent. She'd been pushed too far by Megan's behavior too. Megan threw her plate in the trash, steak and all. "You're both monsters. You know what's monstrous? Trying to destroy your father's livelihood because you watched some Netflix documentary. Animals are dying, and if I lose my job, we're homeless. But I guess that doesn't matter if the cows are happy." She ran upstairs, posted about her abusive carnist parents, forcing meat on her. Her vegan friends suggested calling CPS. The next morning, she made peanut butter toast. "Where's your expensive vegan bacon?" I asked. "We're out. Better get a job to buy more." "Oh wait, the vegan place downtown closed. No customers." She glared. "This isn't over." "You're right. Tonight's pork chops." When she came home, we'd donated her mini fridge to Goodwill. Her oat milk now sat next to our regular milk. Her veggie burgers touched our ground beef. This is psychological warfare. This is reality. You live in a house funded by a steakhouse. She's eaten only peanut butter sandwiches since, refusing family dinners. Fine by me. We can finally eat without being called murderers. Yesterday she tried again, bringing 3 vegan friends to the steakhouse during my shift. They sat in my section, ordered waters, and started reading slaughterhouse statistics loudly to other tables. Security removed them. My manager gave me my final warning. Last night, I found Megan packing a bag. "Running away?" I asked. "Moving out. Rebecca's parents said I can stay there. They're ethical vegans who understand." "Rebecca, whose dad owns the leather shop." She paused. "That's different." "Right. Dead cows for jackets is ethical. Dead cows for food isn't. I'm leaving tomorrow. Good luck. You're still 17. I'll report you as a runaway. Mom will let me go." My wife appeared in the doorway. "Actually, I won't." Megan looked betrayed. "You're taking his side?" "There are no sides. You're our daughter, but you've been incredibly cruel to us." "I'm standing up for beliefs. You're attacking the people who love you most." This morning, Megan was gone. Her room empty except for a note. "I'm 18 in 2 months. The second I am, I'm gone forever. Enjoy your blood money." My wife cried. I felt numb. We'd driven away our only child over dietary choices that spiraled into extremism. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Jackson? This is Officer Davis. We have your daughter at the station." "Is she hurt?" "No, but she's in trouble. She and several friends broke into Riverside Farms last night. They released 40 cattle onto the highway. 3 car accidents. 1 person's in critical condition." My stomach dropped. "She's being charged with felony trespassing, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. If the injured person dies, it becomes manslaughter." "Where is she now?" "Holding cell. She's asking for you." I drove to the station in silence. Found Megan behind bars, no longer the righteous warrior, just a scared kid who'd gone too far. "Dad, I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. We were saving the cows. You might have killed a human being. The cows were going to die anyway. And now someone's mother might die because you decided you were judge and jury." The officer approached. "The victim just went into surgery. If they don't make it, your daughter's looking at 15 years. Megan started sobbing. "Dad, please, I need help." I looked at my daughter, the girl who called me a murderer daily, who tried to destroy my job, who chose cows over her family. "You wanted to be treated like an adult with adult convictions. This is what that looks like." The officer's phone rang. He answered, his face grave. The victim didn't make it. I couldn't move. My legs felt like concrete blocks stuck to the police station floor. Megan's face went completely white behind those bars, like someone drained all the blood out of her in 2 seconds. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then she started breathing really fast, these short, gasping breaths that got faster and faster. Her hands grabbed the bars and her knuckles turned white. The confident activist who protested my workplace was gone. What I saw was a terrified kid who just realized she might have killed someone. Officer Torres stepped closer to the cell. She explained that the charges were being upgraded to involuntary manslaughter. Megan would be held without bail until her court date in 72 hours. The words hit like punches. No bail. Manslaughter. 72 hours. Megan's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the metal bench in the cell. She wasn't the warrior fighting for cow rights anymore. She was just my daughter, sobbing so hard her whole body shook, and she'd just realized what she'd actually done. My own knees went weak. I grabbed the wall to stay standing. Officer Torres kept talking about procedures and paperwork, but her voice sounded far away, like I was underwater. I pulled out my phone and called Bonnie with shaking hands. She answered on the first ring, her voice scared because it was past midnight. I told her to come to the police station. I told her Megan was arrested. I couldn't make myself say the rest. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area, staring at nothing. Other people came and went, normal police station business, but everything felt wrong and distant. When Bonnie rushed through the doors, her face was pale and her hair was messy from getting dressed fast. She looked at me, and I had to tell her. Someone died. A woman died because Megan released those cows. Bonnie's face changed. She put her hand over her mouth and ran to the bathroom. I heard her throwing up. I just sat there. We couldn't process it. Our daughter's belief system, her ideology about saving animals, had cost someone their life. A real person with a family was dead. When Bonnie came back out, her eyes were red and she was shaking. We sat next to each other but didn't touch. We didn't know what to say. What do you say when your kid kills someone? The booking officer came out after a while. He said we could have 5 minutes with Megan before they moved her to county jail. We followed him back. Megan was still crying, but now it was hysterical crying, the kind where you can barely breathe. When she saw us, she pressed against the bars. She begged us to fix this. She kept saying she didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. She just wanted to save the cows. For the first time in 6 months, she sounded like our daughter instead of a stranger spouting radical talking points. She sounded scared and young and sorry, but sorry doesn't bring dead people back. The 5 minutes ended too fast. They took Megan away in handcuffs to transport her. Bonnie and I walked to the car in complete silence. It was 3 a.m. The parking lot lights made everything look yellow and sick. I drove home on empty streets. Neither of us said a word the whole way. When we got inside our house, everything looked normal, but felt completely wrong. Bonnie walked into the kitchen, and then she just broke. She started crying, these big sobbing cries that came from deep in her chest. I stood there and realized my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't stop them. The full weight of what happened started sinking in. Our daughter killed someone. A real person was dead. Megan was going to prison. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, but my brain wouldn't shut off. At 6 a.m, I gave up and called Wallace. I told him I was sick and couldn't come in. His voice sounded weird on the phone, uncomfortable. He said he understood. Then he said everyone at the steakhouse had already heard about the cattle release. It was all over the local news. I turned on the TV after we hung up. There it was on the morning news. Fatal accident on Highway 47. Cattle on the road. 1 dead. The reporter stood in front of Riverside Farms. They showed footage of cop cars and ambulances from last night. They said police arrested several teens for releasing the cattle. I felt physically sick knowing Megan caused this. Bonnie came downstairs and started calling lawyers. She had a list she'd printed from the internet. Most of them asked about the charges and then quoted fees. $50,000, $60,000, $75,000 just to take the case. We sat at the kitchen table with our bank statements spread out. We had maybe $12,000 in savings. Our house had barely any value because we'd only owned it for 6 years. I had no idea how we'd afford a real lawyer for a manslaughter charge. By afternoon, we'd called 15 lawyers. Most were too expensive or wouldn't take the case. Then we found Barnaby Shepard. He agreed to meet with us for a consultation. We drove to his office in this old building downtown. Barnaby was in his 50s with gray hair and a tired face. He sat us down and didn't waste time being nice about it. Involuntary manslaughter in our state carries 3 to 10 years in prison. With someone actually dead and Megan's actions being so deliberate, the prosecutor would push for the maximum sentence. He said we were looking at serious prison time. Real prison, not juvenile detention, because Megan would turn 18 in less than 2 months. The consultation cost us $300 we didn't have. We drove home in silence again. That night, everything exploded. Bonnie started screaming at me in the kitchen. She said I pushed Megan too far. The steakhouse job, the punishment dinners, taking away her mini fridge. I made Megan feel attacked in her own home. I yelled back that Bonnie enabled everything. She never set any boundaries. She let Megan's activism get more and more extreme without ever saying no. We had the worst fight of our marriage. Both of us were looking for someone to blame besides our daughter. Both of us were drowning in guilt. Bonnie slept in Megan's empty room that night. I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about the woman who died, Anya Melendez. Officer Torres had said her name. I didn't know anything about her except that Megan's actions killed her. Was she young or old? Did she have kids? What was she doing on that highway at night? The guilt crushed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Not just guilt for what Megan did, but guilt for all the times I dismissed her activism as just a phase. I saw the signs that she was getting radicalized. The extreme online groups, the escalating protests, the way she talked about animals mattering more than anything else. I saw all of it, and I just got mad instead of recognizing how dangerous it was becoming. Now someone was dead because I didn't take it seriously enough to actually stop her. The arraignment happened 3 days later. Bonnie and I sat in the courthouse on hard wooden benches, waiting for Megan's case to be called. When they brought her out, I barely recognized my daughter. The orange jumpsuit made her look tiny and young, nothing like the fierce activist who'd stood outside my workplace with that sign. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, and she kept her eyes down as they led her to stand before the judge. The judge read the charges in a flat voice: involuntary manslaughter, felony trespassing, destruction of property, reckless endangerment. Each word hit like a physical blow. Megan started crying when the prosecutor argued against bail, citing her note about leaving at 18 as flight risk. The judge agreed. No bail. Megan would stay in county jail until trial. She looked back at us as they led her away, and I saw real fear in her eyes for the first time. Barnaby met us in the hallway after. He pulled us into an empty conference room and spread papers across the table. Megan's social media posts, screenshots of her vegan group chats, the note she'd left about blood money. He explained that the prosecutor already had all of this and would use it to show premeditation. The running away posts made it look like Megan knew she might face consequences and planned to flee. The blood money note showed she had contempt for the system. It would be hard to argue this was just youthful idealism gone wrong when she documented her escalating extremism online. We drove home in silence again. The next morning, the newspaper ran a front-page story about Anya. I sat at the kitchen table staring at her photo for over an hour. She was 32, a nurse at the children's hospital, married to Cooper, 2 kids, a girl aged 7 and a boy aged 4. The photo showed all 4 of them at the beach, smiling and happy. Anya had dark hair and kind eyes. The article talked about her dedication to her patients and how she always volunteered for extra shifts. I kept looking at those 2 kids and imagining them asking where their mom was. My daughter took their mother from them over some cows. I felt sick, actually physically sick. I barely made it to the bathroom before throwing up. Bonnie found me there 20 minutes later, still sitting on the floor. We got approved for our first jail visit that afternoon. The county jail was gray and depressing with harsh fluorescent lights. We went through security and sat in a visiting room with plastic chairs bolted to the floor. When they brought Megan in, she looked like she'd aged 5 years in 3 days. Dark circles under her eyes, her hair greasy and pulled back. She sat down across from us and immediately started crying. She said she was sorry over and over. She didn't think anyone would get hurt. The cows were supposed to be saved. That was the whole point. I realized she genuinely never connected her actions to human consequences. In her mind, she was rescuing animals. The possibility of someone dying on that highway never entered her thinking. She was so focused on cow suffering that human suffering didn't register as real. We stayed for the full hour but barely spoke. What was there to say? I had to go back to work the next day because we desperately needed the money. Legal bills were already piling up, and we'd barely started. Wallace had been decent about giving me time off, but we couldn't afford for me to miss more shifts. Walking into the steakhouse felt like walking into enemy territory. My coworkers were weird around me. Lots of awkward hellos and people avoiding eye contact. I was prepping vegetables in the kitchen when I heard 2 servers talking by the walk-in. One of them said my daughter was a murderer, said it casually like she was commenting on the weather. The other one agreed and said, I must be a terrible parent to raise someone like that. I had to hide in the walk-in freezer for 10 minutes to keep from breaking down. I stood there among the hanging meat in the cold and cried. Barnaby called 5 days after the arraignment. The prosecutor made an offer. 7 years in state prison with possibility of parole after 5. He said we should seriously consider it. If we went to trial and lost, Megan could get the full 10 years. And with her turning 18 in 6 weeks, she'd be sentenced as an adult no matter what. 7 years was better than 10. But 7 years was still 7 years. Megan would be 25 when she got out. Her entire young adulthood gone. We visited Megan again to discuss the plea deal. She refused it immediately. She kept insisting she was trying to save animals. She didn't murder anyone. Barnaby tried to explain that involuntary manslaughter doesn't require intent to kill, just reckless actions that cause death. But Megan got stuck on the word murder. She couldn't accept responsibility for Anya's death because in her mind, murder means planning to kill someone. She thought this was all a mistake that got out of hand. Barnaby looked frustrated when we left. He said Megan needed to understand the reality of her situation fast. I started noticing a man at the courthouse during Megan's preliminary hearings. He sat in the gallery every time, always in the same spot. Dark hair, mid-30s, wearing a suit. He stared at Megan with this expression I couldn't read. Grief mixed with rage, mixed with something else. Barnaby pulled me aside after one hearing and told me that was Cooper, Anya's husband. He'd been at every single proceeding, just sitting there watching. Barnaby warned us that victim impact statements at sentencing could be devastating. The prosecutor would absolutely use the family's pain to push for maximum punishment. Having Cooper there was a constant reminder of what Megan took from him. Bonnie started falling apart. She couldn't sleep. She'd wake up gasping from panic attacks in the middle of the night. She kept seeing images of Anya's kids without their mother. Our doctor prescribed anxiety medication, but it barely helped. Bonnie started seeing a therapist twice a week. Our marriage was hanging by a thread. We processed guilt and blame differently. I threw myself into work and tried to stay busy. Bonnie wanted to talk about everything constantly. We barely spoke beyond discussing Megan's case. We'd eat dinner in silence and then go to separate rooms. 3 weeks after Megan's arrest, the police arrested Kellen. He was one of the other kids who'd been at Riverside that night. Apparently, he'd been bragging about it online, and someone reported him. Barnaby called to tell us. Kellen took a plea deal immediately. Probation and community service in exchange for testifying against Megan. Barnaby said this was very bad for us. It meant the prosecutor had a cooperative witness who could describe exactly what happened that night and confirm Megan's role in planning it. Our case just got significantly harder. Barnaby called 2 days later and said he had copies of the discovery materials. I drove to his office, and he handed me a thick folder with printouts of Megan's online group chats. I sat in his conference room and started reading. The messages went back 6 months, right when Megan first went vegan. Adult activists with usernames like Freedom Fighter and Animal Warrior were posting constantly about direct action and liberation. They shared guides on how to break into farms. They posted videos of other activists releasing animals. And they kept pushing the teenagers in the group to take action, saying that real activists don't just talk, they do. One message from someone named Evan said that laws protecting animal agriculture were immoral and breaking them was a moral duty. Another from a woman calling herself Sage said that anyone who wasn't willing to risk arrest didn't actually care about animals. I read through hundreds of messages where these grown adults encouraged kids to commit crimes. My hands shook holding the papers. These people radicalized my daughter. They took her idealism and twisted it into something dangerous. They made her think breaking into a farm and releasing cattle onto a highway was heroic instead of reckless. I wanted to find every single one of them and make them face what they'd done. Barnaby said the prosecutor was considering charges against some of the adult organizers, but it wouldn't help Megan's case. She still made the choice to go to Riverside that night. The next morning, Wallace called me into his office at the steakhouse. He looked uncomfortable, kept adjusting papers on his desk. Corporate had concerns about the publicity, he said. The story was getting picked up by news outlets. People were leaving bad reviews online mentioning my daughter. He wasn't firing me, but he was reducing my hours to part-time until things settled down. I'd work 3 shifts a week instead of 5. The cut would drop my income by 40%. I asked when things might settle down and Wallace just shrugged. I walked out of his office doing math in my head. 40% less income right when we needed money most for Barnaby's fees and court costs. We were already draining our savings. Now we'd drain them faster. Bonnie picked up extra shifts at her retail job to try compensating for my lost hours. She started working 6 days a week, coming home at 9 or 10 at night. I'd see her kick off her shoes in the entryway, her feet swollen and her face exhausted. We were both running on empty, barely sleeping, eating whatever was quick and easy. Our house felt like a tomb with Megan's empty room upstairs. Neither of us could bring ourselves to go in there. We ate silent dinners that tasted like ash. Everything reminded us of our daughter in jail. The vegan cookbooks on the shelf, her jacket still hanging by the door, the mini fridge space in the garage where we'd put her separate groceries. I'd find Bonnie sometimes just standing in the hallway staring at Megan's closed bedroom door, and I didn't know what to say to make anything better. Barnaby arranged for a forensic psychologist to evaluate Megan. The defense strategy was to show she'd been manipulated by older activists and didn't fully understand consequences. The psychologist spent 3 hours with Megan at the jail, then wrote up a report. Barnaby called to go over the findings. The report said Megan showed signs of ideological radicalization similar to cult indoctrination. She'd been systematically exposed to escalating extremist rhetoric that normalized illegal activity. The psychologist noted that Megan's age and developmental stage made her particularly vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. But then came the part that hurt our case. The report also said Megan was intelligent and capable of understanding that releasing large animals onto a highway at night was dangerous. She knew there was risk of harm. She chose to do it anyway because she'd been convinced that animal liberation justified that risk. So the evaluation was a mixed bag. It showed she'd been radicalized but didn't prove she lacked criminal responsibility. I found out about Anya's memorial service from the newspaper. It was being held at the children's hospital where she'd worked. I didn't tell Bonnie or Barnaby I was going. I just got in my car and drove there. The chapel was packed with nurses, doctors, families. I slipped into the back row and tried to make myself small. People got up and told stories about Anya, how she always volunteered for the hardest shifts, how she'd stay late to comfort scared kids, how she organized the hospital toy drive every Christmas, how she remembered every patient's name and their siblings' names too. A doctor said Anya had this way of making frightened children feel safe just by being in the room. Her best friend from nursing school talked about how Anya had wanted to be a nurse since she was 8 years old, after a nurse helped her through a scary hospital stay. Every story made it more real that my daughter took this person away from the world. Then I saw Cooper in the front row with 2 little girls on either side of him. The older one was crying into his shoulder. The younger one was playing with a stuffed animal, too young to fully understand. Cooper turned around at one point, and his eyes landed on me. His face went from grief to pure rage in a second. He started to stand up, but an older woman next to him, probably Anya's mother, put her hand on his arm and said something. He sat back down, but kept staring at me with this look of absolute hatred. I sat through the whole service listening to what a kind, dedicated nurse and mother Anya had been. When it ended, I left quickly through a side door. I sat in my car in the parking lot and cried for the first time since Megan's arrest. Not for us, not for Megan, but for Anya and her family and everything they'd lost. Megan turned 18 in county jail. Bonnie and I brought her a small cake during visitation, vanilla with pink frosting because that used to be her favorite. We had to get special permission, and the guards inspected it thoroughly before letting us bring it in. Megan came out to the visitation room and she looked terrible. She'd lost maybe 15 pounds. Her cheeks were hollow, and she had dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her jail uniform hung loose on her frame. She tried to smile when she saw the cake but couldn't eat any of it. Her hands shook too much. She whispered that the other inmates called her the cow killer. Some of them thought it was funny. Others were angry because one woman's cousin had been in one of the cars that crashed. Megan said she was terrified of what actual prison would be like if she got convicted. County jail was bad enough, but everyone said state prison was so much worse. She asked if there was any chance she wouldn't have to go to prison, and Bonnie and I couldn't lie to her. The best case scenario was still years behind bars. We sang Happy Birthday quietly, and Megan cried through the whole song. Rebecca's parents released a statement to the local media the next week. The ethical vegans who'd offered to take Megan in now wanted everyone to know they condemned her actions. They said they had no idea she was planning something so dangerous. They supported peaceful activism only. They were deeply sorry for Anya's family. The statement made the news and got shared all over social media. The online vegan community Megan had been part of completely fractured. Some people were defending her, calling her a martyr for the cause, and saying Anya's death was a tragic accident, but didn't change the fact that animals needed liberation. Others were denouncing Megan, saying she'd given animal rights activism a terrible name and set the movement back years with her reckless behavior. Megan saw all of it because other inmates would tell her about things they'd seen online. She felt completely abandoned by the community she'd sacrificed everything for. The adults who'd encouraged her to take direct action were nowhere to be found now that she was facing real consequences. The prosecutor filed a motion to introduce evidence of Megan's protests at my workplace. The argument was that it showed a pattern of escalating illegal behavior and disregard for how her actions affected others. Barnaby fought the motion hard, saying the protests were irrelevant to the charges and would only prejudice the jury against Megan, but the judge ruled in the prosecutor's favor. Now the jury would hear about how Megan had harassed me at work, disrupted business, brought her friends to cause problems, and tried to get me fired. It made her look even more reckless and self-centered, someone who cared more about her ideology than about the people around her, even her own father. Barnaby said this was a significant blow to our defense strategy. Bonnie and I started marriage counseling because we were barely functioning as a couple. We'd gone from partners to strangers living in the same house. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who specialized in families in crisis. She had us each talk about how we were handling everything. Bonnie said she felt like she was drowning and couldn't breathe. I said I felt numb most of the time. The therapist helped us see that we were both drowning in guilt. I was guilty about being too harsh with the punishment dinners and the way I'd handled Megan's activism. Bonnie was guilty about being too permissive and not setting boundaries earlier. But instead of the guilt bringing us together, it was tearing us apart. We were each so consumed by our own guilt that we couldn't support each other. The therapist gave us homework about communicating and being present with each other. It felt impossible, but we had to try. 2 weeks later, I got a letter forwarded through Barnaby. It was from Cooper's attorney. Cooper wanted to meet with me face-to-face before the trial. Barnaby strongly advised against it. He said nothing good could come from that meeting. Cooper was angry and grieving, and there was no telling what might happen. But I told Barnaby I was going to do it anyway. I felt like I owed it to Anya's family to let them express their pain directly to me, to let Cooper say whatever he needed to say. Barnaby made me sign a waiver acknowledging I was going against legal advice. He set up the meeting for the following week at his office with him present. I didn't tell Bonnie because I knew she'd try to stop me. I just knew I had to face Cooper and whatever he needed to say to me about what my daughter had done to his wife. I arrived at Barnaby's office 20 minutes early, my hands shaking so bad I had to grip the steering wheel just to keep them still. The receptionist looked at me with this mix of pity and discomfort that I was getting used to seeing on people's faces, then told me Cooper wasn't there yet. I sat in the waiting area staring at a motivational poster about justice while my stomach churned. When Cooper walked in, he looked smaller than I expected, maybe 5'8" with thinning brown hair and glasses, wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt like he'd forgotten how to care about normal things. Our eyes met for a second, and I saw this flash of pure hate that made me want to run. But then Barnaby appeared and led us both into a conference room with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. Cooper sat on one side, I sat on the other, and Barnaby positioned himself at the head like a referee. Cooper pulled out his phone without saying anything and started swiping through photos, then turned the screen toward me. 2 little girls, maybe 4 and 7, sitting on a couch with a woman who had dark curly hair and a bright smile. The older girl had her mother's eyes. Cooper swiped again and showed me another photo of the whole family at a beach, the girls building a sandcastle while the woman laughed at something off camera. He kept swiping, showing me birthday parties and Christmas mornings and ordinary moments that would never happen again, and I couldn't look away even though each photo felt like a knife. He finally set the phone down, and his voice came out rough and tired. He told me about their last morning together, how his wife woke up early to make pancakes for the girls before her shift at the hospital, how his youngest daughter spilled syrup on her pajamas and his wife just laughed and cleaned her up without getting mad, how she kissed both girls goodbye and told them she'd bring home ice cream after work, how she kissed him and said she loved him and walked out the door, and that was the last time any of them saw her alive. Cooper's hands were flat on the table, fingers spread wide like he was trying to hold himself together. He asked me how I could raise a daughter who thought cow lives mattered more than human lives, and his voice cracked on the word human. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out because what could I possibly say that wouldn't sound like I was making excuses or minimizing what Megan did? I finally managed to say I was sorry, that I knew sorry meant nothing, but I didn't have anything else, and Cooper's face twisted up. He told me his 7-year-old asked him every night when Mommy was coming home, and he had to explain death to a child who still believed in tooth fairies. He told me his 4-year-old started having accidents at night because she was so scared, waking up screaming for her mother who would never come. He told me his wife was a pediatric nurse who spent her days taking care of other people's children, and now his children didn't have a mother because my daughter decided animals were more important. I sat there taking it, feeling each word like a physical blow, because he deserved to say all of it and more. Barnaby tried to interject something about the legal process, but Cooper cut him off, saying he didn't care about legal process, he cared about the fact that his wife was dead, and his daughters were traumatized, and my daughter got to keep breathing while his wife was in the ground. He asked me what I was going to tell Megan, if I was going to explain to her what she really did, make her understand the actual human cost of her ideology. I told him yes, that I would make sure Megan understood, and Cooper laughed this bitter, broken sound. He said understanding didn't bring back his wife, didn't fix his daughters, didn't undo any of this nightmare. He stood up then, shoving his chair back so hard it hit the wall, and told me he hoped Megan got the maximum sentence because his wife got a death sentence and his daughters got a lifetime sentence of growing up without their mother. He walked out without another word, leaving me sitting there with Barnaby in the silent conference room. Barnaby asked if I was okay, and I told him no, I wasn't okay, and I'd never be okay again. But I needed to go home and talk to Bonnie about the plea deal, because Cooper was right about everything. I drove home in a daze, Cooper's words echoing in my head, along with images of those two little girls who would grow up without their mother. Bonnie was in the kitchen making dinner when I walked in, and she took one look at my face and turned off the stove. I told her I'd met with Cooper, and she went pale, asking what happened. I described the meeting, the photos, what Cooper said about his daughters, and as I talked, Bonnie started crying silently. When I finished, I told her I thought we needed to convince Megan to take the plea deal, that putting Cooper and those little girls through a trial where they'd have to hear every detail of how their mother died felt unbearably cruel. Bonnie's tears stopped, and her face went hard. She asked if I was seriously giving up on our daughter, if I was just going to let them lock her away for years without even fighting. I said I wasn't giving up. I was being realistic about what Megan did and what she deserved, and Bonnie exploded. She yelled that Megan was our child, that we were supposed to protect her no matter what, that she made a terrible mistake, but she didn't deserve to lose her entire life. I yelled back that our daughter killed someone, that she took a mother away from two little girls, and maybe she did deserve to lose years of her life because Anja lost all of hers. Bonnie threw a dish towel at me and screamed that I'd been waiting for an excuse to punish Megan ever since the vegan thing started, that I'd been cruel to her with those punishment dinners, and now I was being cruel again by not fighting for her. I told her she was the one who'd been too soft, who'd enabled Megan's extremism by never setting real boundaries, and if Bonnie had backed me up earlier, maybe Megan wouldn't have felt so entitled to do whatever she wanted. We went back and forth like that for an hour, both of us saying horrible things we'd been holding in for months, all the resentment and blame and guilt pouring out in the worst fight of our marriage. Bonnie finally grabbed her pillow from our bed and said she was sleeping in Megan's room because she couldn't stand to look at me. I let her go, then sat alone in our bedroom staring at the wall until after midnight, feeling like my family was completely shattered and I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. 3 days later, Barnaby called to say the prosecutor had revised the plea offer. We met him at his office, and he explained the new terms: 6 years in state prison with parole possibility after 4, and the prosecutor was willing to make this deal because they wanted to avoid the expense and publicity of a trial. Bonnie and I sat there processing the numbers. 6 years meaning Megan would be 24 when she got out if she served the full sentence, 22 if she made parole. Barnaby said this was actually a decent offer considering the charges, that if we went to trial and lost, Megan could get the full 10 years. He arranged for us to meet with Megan at the county jail to discuss it. When they brought her into the visitation room, she looked thin and exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and dark circles under her eyes. We sat across from her with Barnaby, and he explained the revised plea offer in careful legal terms. Megan listened with her arms wrapped around herself, and when Barnaby finished, she asked what 6 years actually meant. Like, did she understand correctly that she'd be in prison until she was almost 24? Barnaby confirmed that yes, if she served the full sentence without parole, she'd be 23 going on 24 when released. Megan started crying, saying 6 years was her entire adult life so far, that she'd miss everything, college and jobs and normal life, and she still didn't understand why saving animals should cost her everything when she didn't mean to hurt anyone. Bonnie reached across the table to hold Megan's hand, but Megan pulled away. She asked if we were telling her to take the deal, and Bonnie immediately said no, we weren't telling her anything, we just wanted her to understand her options. I stayed quiet, because I knew if I opened my mouth, I'd say she should take it, and that would start another fight with Bonnie. Megan looked at me and asked what I thought, and I told her the truth, that I thought 6 years was less than she deserved, but more than I could stand seeing her serve. She asked what that meant, and I said it meant the choice was hers, but she needed to understand what going to trial would mean for Cooper's family. Megan got defensive, saying she knew what it would mean. She wasn't stupid, but 6 years was also a really long time to lose. Barnaby interrupted to explain that if we went to trial, The prosecutor would bring in victim impact testimony, photos of the family, probably even have the daughters testify, and the jury would see all of that before deciding Megan's fate. Megan went quiet, staring at the table, and finally said she needed time to think about it. We left the jail with nothing decided, Bonnie angry at me for not being more supportive, and me frustrated that Megan still seemed more focused on what she was losing than what she'd taken from others. I couldn't stop thinking about Cooper's daughters, so I went back to the jail 2 days later to visit Megan alone. Bonnie didn't know I was going, and I didn't tell her because I knew she'd try to stop me or insist on coming. The guard brought Megan to the visitation room, and she looked surprised to see just me. I sat down and told her I needed to talk to her about Cooper and his family. Really talk. Not the sanitized version we'd given her before. She started to protest, but I held up my hand and said she was going to listen. I described meeting Cooper in detail, how small and broken he looked, how he showed me photos of his daughters and wife. I told her about the pancakes and the syrup spill and the goodbye kisses, making her see the ordinary morning that became the last morning. I described what Cooper said about explaining death to his 7-year-old, about his 4-year-old wetting the bed from fear, about bedtime when both girls cried for their mother. Megan's face crumpled as I talked, but I didn't stop. I told her that if she went to trial, those little girls would have to come to court and see photos of their mother's accident scene, hear testimony about how she died, watch their father break down on the witness stand. I told her the 7-year-old was old enough to remember the trial forever, to understand that the teenager at the defense table was why her mother was dead. I asked Megan if she could really put those children through that, just to avoid prison time, if her freedom was worth that much more suffering for a family that had already lost everything. Megan was sobbing now, her shoulders shaking, and she said she didn't know. She didn't know what to do. I told her this wasn't about what she wanted anymore. It was about taking responsibility for what she did, and sometimes taking responsibility meant accepting punishment, even when it felt unfair. She looked up at me with red eyes and asked if I hated her. I told her no, I didn't hate her. I loved her, and that's why this was so hard, because I had to watch her face consequences for something she couldn't undo. She was quiet for a long time, then said she'd been selfish, that she'd been so focused on cow suffering that she never thought about human suffering she might cause. She said she kept telling herself the cows were going to die anyway, so saving them was worth any risk, but she never really thought through what those risks were or who might pay the price. She admitted she'd convinced herself that anyone who got hurt by animal liberation was acceptable collateral damage for the greater good, and she saw now how messed up that thinking was. I asked if she meant that, or if she was just saying what I wanted to hear, and she insisted she meant it, that being in jail had given her a lot of time to think, and she was starting to see how her ideology had blinded her to reality. She said she still believed animals deserved better treatment, but she understood now that breaking laws and endangering people wasn't the way to help them. We sat in silence for a minute, then I told her the plea deal was probably the best option, that it gave her a path forward instead of risking 10 years if the trial went badly. She nodded slowly and said she'd think about it seriously this time. A week later, Barnaby called with more news from the prosecutor's office. They were considering filing additional charges against the adult activists who'd organized the cattle release, conspiracy, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and they wanted Megan to cooperate. Barnaby explained that if Megan agreed to testify against the adults, providing evidence of how they'd planned the action and recruited her, the prosecutor might be willing to reduce her sentence even further, maybe down to 4 years with parole after 3. We met with Megan at the jail again to discuss this new development. She looked conflicted when Barnaby explained what cooperation would mean, testifying in court about the planning meetings, the encrypted chat groups, how the adults had encouraged her and other teenagers to take direct action. Megan said those people had been her friends. They'd made her feel like she was part of something important, and the idea of turning on them felt wrong. Bonnie pointed out that those friends had abandoned her the second she got arrested, that none of them had visited or even sent letters. Barnaby added that the adults had used her, knowing she was a minor and more vulnerable to legal consequences, and they'd disappeared while she sat in jail facing years in prison. Megan argued that they were all true believers in the cause, that they hadn't used her. They'd all been working together for animal liberation. I asked if those true believers had offered to help pay for her legal defense or support her family, and Megan went quiet. Barnaby explained that the prosecutor had evidence showing the adults had specifically targeted teenagers for recruitment, knowing younger activists would be more passionate and less likely to consider legal consequences. He showed Megan printouts of chat logs where adult members discussed how to radicalize and mobilize teen members, talking about teenagers like they were useful tools for the movement. Megan read through the logs with growing horror, seeing how calculated and manipulative the recruitment had been. One message talked about finding kids with family conflicts who were looking for belonging. Another discussed pushing teens toward illegal actions while adult members stayed safe. Megan asked if she could see more of the evidence, and Barnaby pulled out a thick folder of printouts. She spent 20 minutes reading through conversations she'd never seen, messages between adult activists, planning actions, and deciding which teenagers to involve. Several messages mentioned her specifically, talking about how her anger at her parents made her a good candidate for escalation to direct action. One adult activist had written that Megan was perfect because she was smart enough to plan, but emotional enough to act without overthinking consequences. Reading that broke something in Megan's face. She looked up at us and said she'd been so stupid, thinking these people respected her and valued her commitment, when really they'd just been using her passion as a weapon. She said she'd testify if it meant stopping them from doing this to other kids. Barnaby cautioned that testifying would make her unpopular in the activist community, that she'd probably face backlash online and maybe even threats. Megan said she didn't care anymore, that the activist community had already turned on her anyway, calling her reckless and saying she'd damaged the movement. She told us to work out the deal with the prosecutor, that she'd cooperate fully. The hate mail started arriving at our house about a week after local media published Megan's name and photo. The first letter came in a plain envelope with no return address, just a single page calling us terrible parents who raised a killer. Bonnie opened it at the kitchen table and started shaking, then handed it to me without a word. More letters came over the next few days, some angry, some just sad, all of them blaming us for what Megan did. One person wrote that we should be charged as accessories for not stopping her. Another said we deserved to lose our daughter because we'd clearly failed as parents. A few letters were sympathetic, but most were harsh, and each one felt like proof that the whole community saw us as failures. Then one morning I went out to get the newspaper and found spray paint across our garage door, big red letters spelling murderer's house. I stood there staring at it, feeling sick, knowing the neighbors had probably already seen it. I called in to work and spent 4 hours scrubbing the paint off with chemical remover, my arms aching and my eyes watering from the fumes. Wallace called while I was cleaning to ask if everything was okay, and I told him about the vandalism. He was quiet for a second, then said corporate was getting calls from protesters threatening to boycott the steakhouse because they employed the father of the cow killer. I asked if I was fired, and Wallace said no, not yet, but I needed to keep my head down and not cause any more problems. After I finished cleaning the garage, I sat on the front steps feeling the weight of community judgment that would follow our family for years. Our neighbors across the street had stopped waving when they saw us. The family next door suddenly had no time to chat. Even the mail carrier looked uncomfortable delivering our mail. I thought about moving, but we couldn't afford it with legal bills piling up, and besides, running away wouldn't change what Megan did. Bonnie came home from work and saw the garage door, still slightly discolored where the paint had been, and she just broke down crying on the front lawn. I helped her inside, and we sat together on the couch, not talking, just trying to survive another day of this nightmare. I started researching online radicalization late one night when I couldn't sleep, typing phrases into search engines about how teenagers get recruited into extreme movements. What I found made me furious. There were whole networks of adult activists who deliberately targeted vulnerable teenagers, using social media and encrypted apps to find kids who were passionate about causes but didn't understand legal consequences. I found articles about other families whose kids had been radicalized, parents describing the same pattern we'd seen with Megan, the sudden personality change, the extreme rhetoric, the rejection of family. I started looking specifically for the vegan activist groups Megan had joined, and I found forum posts and chat logs that had been leaked or archived. I saw adult activists talking about recruitment strategies, discussing how to identify teenagers who were dealing with family conflict or looking for identity and purpose. They called it building the movement, but it looked like manipulation to me. I found posts where adults praised teenagers for taking direct action, encouraging them to escalate from protests to property destruction to animal releases. I found Megan's username in several threads and traced her activity back 6 months, watching how adult activists had slowly normalized illegal activity in her mind. At first, she'd posted questions about legal protests and petition drives. Adult members responded by saying legal methods didn't work, that the system was designed to protect animal agriculture, that real change required direct action. When Megan expressed worry about getting in trouble, they told her civil disobedience meant accepting consequences, that going to jail for animals was noble. They shared stories of other young activists who'd been arrested, framing them as heroes and martyrs. I found the specific thread where adult activists had planned the Riverside cattle release, and Megan's name came up as someone who'd be willing to participate. One adult wrote that Megan was angry at her family and looking for validation, perfect for an action that required commitment. Another adult suggested targeting Riverside specifically because it was near Megan's house, making it easier for her to participate. They'd deliberately chosen an action that would endanger people, releasing cattle onto a highway at night, and they'd recruited teenagers to do it while adult members stayed home safe. I was shaking with rage reading these conversations, seeing how these people had manipulated my daughter for their cause. They'd taken her idealism and passion and used it as a weapon, then abandoned her when she faced consequences. I printed out everything I could find, building a file of evidence showing how Megan had been groomed by adults who should have known better. Barnaby called me into his office a few days later to discuss the evidence I'd compiled. I brought 3 folders worth of printouts, chat logs, forum posts, social media conversations, all of it documenting Megan's radicalization. Barnaby spent an hour going through the material, making notes and occasionally stopping to read sections more carefully. When he finished, he told me this was exactly what we needed to show the court. He explained that we could use this evidence to demonstrate that while Megan made her own choices, she'd been influenced by adults who deliberately targeted and manipulated her. It wouldn't excuse what she did, but it would provide context, showing she was a teenager groomed by experienced activists who knew how to exploit her idealism. Barnaby said he wanted me to keep documenting everything, to build the most complete picture possible of Megan's radicalization. I spent the next 2 weeks doing nothing but research and documentation. I created a timeline showing Megan's progression from casual interest in veganism to extreme activism, noting when adult activists first made contact and how their influence escalated over time. I identified the specific adults who'd recruited her, finding their real names and locations through cross-referencing usernames and profile information. I documented the rhetoric they'd used, the way they'd normalized illegal activity and framed consequences as badges of honor. I found evidence that these same adults had recruited other teenagers for similar actions, creating a pattern of behavior that showed this wasn't an isolated incident. I discovered that one of the adult activists had a previous arrest for animal liberation activities, but had avoided serious charges by cooperating with prosecutors. Another had written articles advocating for property destruction and violence against people who worked in animal agriculture. A third ran a website that provided tutorials on bypassing farm security and releasing animals. As I compiled this evidence, it became clear that while Megan had made her own choices, she'd also been groomed by people who used her idealism as a weapon. These adults had taken a passionate teenager dealing with family conflict and slowly radicalized her, encouraging increasingly extreme actions while staying safely in the background. They'd praised her for protesting my workplace, told her she was brave for disrupting my shift, encouraged her to escalate to direct action, and when she finally took that direct action and someone died, they'd disappeared, leaving her alone to face consequences while they moved on to recruit the next vulnerable teenager. The sentencing hearing came 3 weeks after the plea was finalized. Bonnie and I sat in the courtroom gallery, and I could feel my hands shaking as we waited for proceedings to start. Megan was brought in wearing her orange jumpsuit, looking thin and pale after 5 months in county jail. The courtroom was packed with people I didn't recognize, and then I saw Cooper sitting in the front row with an older woman who must have been Anya's mother. The judge entered and everyone stood, and my legs felt weak as we sat back down. The prosecutor spoke first about the severity of the crime, but I barely heard her words because I was watching Cooper's face, seeing the raw pain there. Then Barnaby gave a brief statement about Megan's remorse and youth, and it sounded hollow even to me because nothing could change what happened. The judge asked if there were victim impact statements, and Cooper stood up. He walked to the podium carrying a folder, and when he started speaking, his voice was steady, but filled with grief. He talked about the morning Anya died, how she'd kissed their daughters goodbye before her shift at the hospital, how the 4-year-old asked every day when mommy was coming home, and he had to explain death to a child who didn't understand permanent. He described his 7-year-old's nightmares, how she screamed in her sleep about cars and cows and blood. He talked about the empty chair at their dinner table, about his daughters asking why their friends had mommies, and they didn't. Then Cooper turned and looked directly at Megan, and his voice got harder. He said Anya was worth 1,000 cows, worth 1,000,000 cows, that his wife saved children's lives as a nurse, and now his children had no mother because Megan decided animal lives mattered more than human safety. Megan started crying, then sobbing so hard her shoulders shook and she could barely breathe. The bailiff brought her tissues, but she couldn't stop, and I felt sick watching my daughter face the full weight of what she'd done. Cooper sat down, and the judge waited a moment before speaking. His words during sentencing were harsh and deliberate. He said idealism doesn't excuse recklessness, that Megan's privilege allowed her to treat serious matters like a game while others paid the price. He said a woman was dead, children were motherless, a family was destroyed because Megan valued her own moral righteousness over basic human safety. Every word landed like a physical blow, and I watched Megan flinch with each statement. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in state prison, as agreed in the plea deal, with eligibility for parole after 3.5 years. He recommended she spend her time reflecting on the difference between passion and responsibility, between advocacy and violence. Court was adjourned, and they took Megan back to holding. Bonnie and I sat frozen in our seats while people filed out around us. We had 2 weeks before Megan would be transferred to state prison, and Bonnie and I visited her every single day during that time. Megan was different now, quieter and more present in conversations instead of defensive. She asked about Cooper's daughters by name, wanted to know their ages and what they liked, as if learning about them made Anya more real to her. The remorse seemed genuine now, not just fear of punishment, but actual grief for what she'd taken from the world. Megan started writing a letter to Cooper and his daughters, working on it for days between our visits. She showed me drafts and asked if certain words sounded right, if her apology was clear enough. I told her honestly that they might never read it, that Cooper had every right to throw it away unopened. She nodded and kept writing anyway, saying she needed to try even if they never saw it. Barnaby came by during one visit and confirmed he'd passed the letter to Cooper's attorney, but he warned us not to expect any response. On Megan's last day at county jail before the transfer, we sat across from her in the visitation room, and she looked scared. She told us she knew she deserved this, that the 5 years were fair given what she'd done. She said she wished she could take it back, that she'd give anything to have Anya alive, even if it meant all the cows died. I believed her, could see the genuine anguish in her face when she said it, but it didn't change anything because Anya was still gone. Those little girls still had no mother, and Megan still had to serve her time. The next morning, they transferred Megan to Women's State Prison 3 hours away. Bonnie and I made the drive 2 days later for our first visit there. The security procedures were intense compared to county jail, with multiple checkpoints and searches and metal detectors. We waited in a large visiting room with other families, and when they brought Megan out in her prison uniform, she looked so small and young. She told us about her cell with 2 other women, about working in the prison kitchen starting at 5 in the morning. This was her life now for the next several years, and the reality of it hit me hard as I looked at her in that room. A month after Megan's transfer, I testified in the trial against the adult activists who organized the cattle release. I brought all the evidence I'd compiled showing how they'd radicalized Megan through online groups. I described the chat logs where they praised her for protesting my workplace, the posts encouraging direct action, the way they'd normalized illegal activity. 3 of them were convicted of conspiracy and reckless endangerment. They got prison sentences ranging from 18 months to 3 years, which felt like inadequate justice, but was something. At least they'd face consequences for manipulating teenagers into dangerous situations. Bonnie struggled deeply with Megan's incarceration in ways I couldn't fully reach. She started attending a support group for families of incarcerated people that met weekly at a church basement. She came home from meetings looking exhausted, but somehow lighter, and eventually told me about other parents there dealing with similar guilt and grief. Slowly, she started to process that we could love Megan while accepting she must face consequences, that these 2 truths could exist together without contradiction. The trial against the activists ended, and media attention finally died down. Wallace called me into his office at the steakhouse and told me my hours were being restored to full time. He said quietly that he was sorry for what our family went through, and I just nodded because I didn't trust myself to speak. Work became my escape after that, the familiar routine of cooking steaks oddly comforting after months of chaos and grief. 6 months into Megan's sentence, we established a routine of visiting twice monthly and weekly phone calls on Thursday evenings. Megan told us she was adjusting to prison life, that she'd started taking college courses through a prison education program. She was studying environmental science, but with a new focus on policy and ethics rather than radical activism. She talked about learning proper channels for change, about understanding systems instead of just fighting against them. One Thursday evening, Barnaby called instead of Megan. Cooper's attorney had contacted him about a wrongful death civil suit against Megan, which we'd been expecting. Barnaby explained that we had no real assets to speak of, just our modest house with barely any equity. But Cooper deserved the right to pursue the suit, and Barnaby would help us navigate the process with as much dignity as possible. He mentioned we'd likely need to declare bankruptcy eventually, but that was a problem for another day. 2 months after the civil suit discussion, I found myself sitting in a community center conference room with 12 other parents, all of us there because our kids had been radicalized by online groups. The organization was called Parents Against Extremism, and they ran monthly education sessions to help families recognize warning signs before things went too far. The facilitator asked if anyone wanted to share their story, and I raised my hand because staying silent felt like letting Megan's mistakes be meaningless. I told them about the vegan activism that started reasonable and spiraled into breaking laws, about the online groups that normalized illegal activity, about missing the signs until it was too late and someone died. Several parents cried hearing about Anya, and afterward 3 of them came up to thank me for being honest about how bad it could get. One father showed me his son's chat logs that looked exactly like Megan's from a year ago, and I helped him identify the manipulation tactics the adult activists were using. Driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, like maybe all this pain could prevent another family from going through the same thing. Bonnie and I celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary on a Tuesday evening in our living room with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine we couldn't really afford. We didn't go out because we were too tired and too broke, and honestly, neither of us wanted to be around other people. Bonnie looked different to me that night, older, but also stronger somehow, like she'd been broken down and rebuilt into someone tougher. I probably looked the same to her. We talked about the early years when Megan was little, back when our biggest worry was whether she'd get into the right preschool, and we laughed at how stupid those concerns seemed now. We didn't say it out loud, but we both knew we'd survived something that destroyed most marriages, and there was weird strength in that, even though we were still hurting. Bonnie fell asleep on the couch around 10, and I covered her with a blanket and sat there watching her breathe, grateful we were still together, even if we'd never be the same people we were before. 3 weeks later, my phone rang during my lunch break at the steakhouse, and Megan's voice on the other end was quiet and sad. She told me it was Anya's birthday, that she would have been 33 today, and Megan spent the whole morning thinking about Anya's daughters and what they were going through without their mom. Her therapist in prison had her writing letters to Anya that she'd never send, just processing all the guilt and remorse, and Megan said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but also necessary. She described writing about the night of the cattle release, about the moment she realized someone died, about wishing she could take it all back, even if it meant the cows died instead. I listened without interrupting because this was the first time Megan talked about Anya as a real person, instead of just a terrible consequence, and I could hear in her voice that the remorse went deeper than just wanting to avoid punishment. When we hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going back to work. The first parole board review happened exactly 1 year after sentencing, and Bonnie and I drove to the prison to sit in the waiting area during Megan's hearing. We couldn't go in with her, so we just waited and hoped. Barnaby had explained this was routine, and she'd definitely be denied because it was too early, but the board would note her progress for future consideration. When Megan came out 2 hours later, she looked disappointed, but not surprised. The board denied parole as expected, but they'd commented on her good behavior, her college courses, and her genuine remorse in their notes. They said these factors would help when she was eligible for actual parole consideration in 2.5 more years, and while it wasn't the answer we wanted, it was something. Megan hugged us both in the visitation room and said she'd keep working on herself, keep taking classes, keep trying to be better than the person who released those cows. 4 months after that, I sat in a circle of chairs in a neutral meeting room with Cooper Ryan, a trained mediator, and 2 silent observers from the restorative justice program. My hands shook the entire time. The mediator explained the process, how this was about acknowledgement and understanding rather than forgiveness or reconciliation, and then she asked Cooper to speak first. He talked about Anya, about their life together, about the hole her death left in their family that would never be filled. He looked at me and said he needed to see that Megan's family was suffering too, that we weren't monsters who didn't care about what happened. I told him about the guilt that woke me up every night, about loving my daughter while hating what she did, about knowing no amount of suffering on our part would bring Anya back. We sat there for 90 minutes talking about pain and loss and responsibility, and at the end, Cooper said something I didn't expect. He said he'd never be okay with what happened and we'd never be okay with each other, but there was a small measure of acknowledgement between us now that we were both human beings destroyed by the same tragedy. We didn't shake hands when we left, but we nodded at each other, and that tiny gesture felt massive. Bonnie started her facilitator training for the family support group 2 weeks later, attending workshops every Saturday morning for 8 weeks. She came home from the first session energized in a way I hadn't seen in over a year, talking about communication techniques and how to help parents process guilt without drowning in it. She practiced her facilitation skills on me, which felt weird at first, but actually helped us talk about things we'd been avoiding. By week 6, she was co-leading a session with an experienced facilitator, and I sat in the back, watching her help a mother whose son was in prison for armed robbery work, through her shame. Bonnie had found purpose in transforming her pain into support for others, and I watched her come back to life in small ways, laughing again sometimes, sleeping better, looking forward to Saturdays instead of dreading everything. The letter from Megan arrived on a Thursday, 3 pages of her neat handwriting describing her new role mentoring younger inmates. She'd been matched with a 19-year-old girl who got radicalized by an online conspiracy group and committed arson, and Megan was helping her recognize the manipulation tactics and thought patterns that led to destructive choices. Megan wrote about teaching this girl to question extreme rhetoric, to think about consequences before acting, to separate genuine beliefs from cult-like indoctrination. She said she wanted to work in intervention programs for at-risk youth after her release, using her experience to prevent others from making similar mistakes. And for the first time, I could see a real path forward for her, beyond just serving time. She wasn't just surviving prison, she was building something meaningful from the wreckage of her choices. 2 years into Megan's sentence, Cooper's attorney called with the settlement terms. We'd pay $75 monthly for the next 10 years, which was all we could realistically afford without losing our house. The total amount was $9,000, a fraction of what Anya's life was worth, but Cooper's attorney said it mattered to Cooper that we were taking ongoing responsibility. I signed the agreement at our kitchen table with Bonnie beside me, both of us knowing this symbolic payment would never repay the debt, but grateful Cooper was allowing us this way to acknowledge it. The first payment went out the next week, and every month after that when I wrote the check, I thought about Anja and her daughters and the life Megan took from them. The family therapy sessions at the prison started 3 months later, meeting twice monthly in a small counseling room with a therapist who specialized in incarcerated family relationships. The first session was awkward and painful, all of us sitting stiffly and struggling to talk honestly, but the therapist was patient and skilled, helping us understand that Megan was genuinely changed by her experience, that the remorse was real and deep and permanent. She helped us see the difference between the self-righteous teenager who went to prison and the thoughtful adult who was emerging, and she taught us how to be parents to this new version of our daughter. We practiced communication without blame, worked through our own guilt and anger, learned to maintain connection across prison barriers. By the 6th session, we could sit together and talk about the future without everyone crying, and that felt like progress. The letter came from someone I'd never met, a nurse named Pia, who worked with Anya at the Children's Hospital. She'd attended the Restorative Justice Circle as an observer and wanted to reach out afterward. She wrote that Anya's death was still a tragedy that shouldn't have happened, that nothing could make it right or okay, but she could see our family was genuinely trying to make meaning from it, working to prevent similar harm to others, and she thought Anya would have appreciated that. Pia described Anya as someone who believed in rehabilitation and second chances, who saw the good in people even when they'd done terrible things. She said Anya wouldn't want our family destroyed forever by Megan's mistake, that she'd want something constructive to come from her death. I read that letter 5 times, crying each time, grateful for this small grace from someone who loved Anya and could still see our humanity through the horror of what Megan did. I carried Pia's letter with me during the next prison visit, and when I showed it to Megan, she read it 3 times before folding it carefully and holding it against her chest. She asked if she could keep it, and I said yes, watching her tuck it into her small collection of personal items that she stored in a plastic bin under her bunk. The words from someone who knew Anya gave Megan something concrete to hold on to, proof that forgiveness, or at least understanding, might exist somewhere beyond the walls of guilt and grief we all lived in. 6 months later, during a routine visit, Megan's college advisor at the prison pulled Bonnie and me aside after we finished talking with our daughter. She was a middle-aged woman named Dr. Solis, who ran the education programs, and she had a folder in her hands with Megan's name on it. She told us Megan was excelling in all her coursework, maintaining a perfect grade average despite the difficulty of studying in prison conditions. and that her professors consistently praised her thoughtful contributions to class discussions. Dr. Solis opened the folder and showed us Megan's acceptance letter to a bachelor's degree program in social work with a specific focus on intervention strategies for at-risk youth. The program was designed for incarcerated students, allowing Megan to complete most of the degree requirements while still serving her sentence and finish the remaining courses after release. Dr. Solis explained that Megan had written a powerful application essay about her own radicalization and the consequences of extremist thinking, and the admissions committee was impressed by her genuine commitment to using her experience to help prevent similar tragedies. Bonnie started crying right there in the prison meeting room, and I felt something shift in my chest, the first real hope I'd experienced since Megan's arrest, that maybe she could build something meaningful from the wreckage of what she'd done. Megan would have a real career path when she got out, a way to channel her passion for helping others into constructive work instead of destructive activism. 3 years into Megan's sentence, Bonnie and I started looking at smaller houses closer to the prison after calculating how much we spent on gas and time for the 6-hour round-trip visits twice a month. Our current house held too many memories anyway. Megan's empty bedroom upstairs, a constant reminder of the daughter we lost to prison and the life we had before everything fell apart. We found a small 3-bedroom ranch about 40 minutes from the prison facility, half the square footage of our current place, but with lower mortgage payments and utility costs that would help offset the ongoing legal debt. Packing up 20 years of family life was brutal, sorting through Megan's childhood belongings that we'd left untouched in her room, deciding what to keep and what to donate or throw away. Bonnie spent an entire afternoon going through photo albums, crying over pictures of Megan at various ages, the smiling little girl who loved animals in a pure, innocent way before that love twisted into something dangerous. I boxed up my own stuff mechanically, focusing on the practical aspects of moving to avoid thinking too hard about what it meant to leave the house where we'd raised our daughter. The day we closed on the new place, Bonnie and I stood in the empty living room of our old house one last time, and she said it felt like we were closing a chapter on the life we had before. I agreed, understanding that moving wasn't just about convenience or money. It was about accepting the reality of our life now, a life shaped by Megan's choices and the permanent consequences that followed. We set up the new house over the next month, and Bonnie insisted on making one of the bedrooms specifically for Megan, even though she wouldn't be released for at least another year. We painted it a soft blue color that Megan mentioned liking during a recent visit, bought a comfortable bed and desk, hung curtains that let in natural light. Bonnie arranged some of Megan's childhood things on the shelves, a few stuffed animals and books, photos of our family from happier times. I watched her work and understood she needed to create this space, needed to believe our daughter would come home eventually and have a place waiting for her. When Megan was approved for her first extended family visit at the new house, a special program that allowed well-behaved inmates to spend a weekend with family outside the prison, Bonnie spent 3 days cleaning and preparing, even though the house was already spotless. Megan arrived on a Friday afternoon with a corrections officer who would check in periodically throughout the weekend, and when she walked into the house and saw the room we'd set up for her, she stood in the doorway and started crying. She touched the bed, the desk, ran her fingers over the spines of her old books, and said she couldn't believe we'd done this for her after everything she'd put us through. That weekend, we cooked meals together in our small kitchen, Megan chopping vegetables while Bonnie handled the stove, and I set the table, falling into an easy rhythm that felt almost normal. We talked honestly about everything that happened, the escalation of Megan's activism, our failed attempts at boundaries, the night of the cattle release, and its devastating aftermath. The grief and guilt were still present in every conversation, but there was also genuine connection and something that felt like hope for the future. Sunday evening, when the officer came to take Megan back to prison, we all hugged in the driveway for a long time, and Bonnie whispered that we loved her and would be waiting when she came home for good. Megan's parole hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning 3.5 years into her sentence, and this time it wasn't just a routine review, but real consideration for early release. Bonnie and I arrived at the prison 2 hours early, both of us too nervous to eat breakfast, and sat in the waiting area watching other families come and go. When they called us into the hearing room, Megan was already seated at a table with her attorney, wearing the neat clothes we'd brought for the occasion, her hair pulled back and her hands folded calmly in front of her. The parole board consisted of 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, who had thick folders in front of them containing Megan's entire case history and prison record. They asked Megan to speak about her crime and what she'd learned during her incarceration, and she stood up and delivered the most articulate statement I'd ever heard from her. She described the cattle release in detail, taking full responsibility for her actions and the death of Anya, explaining how her ideology had blinded her to the value of human life and the real-world consequences of extreme activism. She talked about her education in prison, her social work degree program, her plans to work in intervention and prevention services for at-risk youth. She acknowledged that nothing she did could bring Anya back or heal the pain she caused Cooper and his daughters, but she was committed to spending the rest of her life trying to prevent other young people from making similar devastating mistakes. The board members asked tough questions about her remorse, her understanding of victim impact, her concrete plans for reintegration into society. Megan answered each one thoughtfully and honestly, never making excuses, always bringing the conversation back to her responsibility and her commitment to making amends through meaningful work. After 40 minutes of questioning, the board dismissed us to deliberate, and we waited in the hallway for an hour that felt like days. When they called us back in, the chairwoman announced that the board was granting parole with strict conditions, including continued therapy, 200 hours of community service, and regular check-ins with a parole officer for the next 5 years. Megan would be released in 2 months after completing the transition program. Bonnie grabbed my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers, and Megan sat perfectly still for a moment before tears started running down her face. The 2 months between parole approval and actual release moved in a strange combination of rushing forward and dragging slowly. Bonnie and I helped Megan apply for jobs in social services, reaching out to the contacts Dr. Solis provided from the prison education program and connecting with parole resources that assisted with employment placement. Megan had several phone interviews from prison and eventually secured a position at a nonprofit youth intervention organization that specifically worked with teenagers showing signs of radicalization or extremist thinking. Her supervisor knew her full history and said during the final interview that Megan's lived experience made her uniquely qualified to reach kids heading down dangerous paths. We also worked on practical reintegration details, setting up a bank account for Megan, getting her a new phone, buying clothes appropriate for professional work. Megan was nervous, but also genuinely ready, telling us during one visit that she wasn't the same self-righteous teenager who went into prison, that she understood consequences now in a way she never had before. She said she was scared of failing, of disappointing us, or letting down the people who believed in her rehabilitation, but she was also determined to prove that her transformation was real and lasting. Bonnie kept a countdown calendar on the kitchen wall, crossing off each day, and I watched my wife slowly relax as release day approached, the constant tension she'd carried for 3.5 years finally beginning to ease. Release day was a Tuesday morning in early September, and Bonnie and I drove to the prison at dawn to be there when the gates opened. We waited in the parking lot with other families picking up released inmates, everyone quiet and tense with anticipation. At 8 o'clock, the release door opened and inmates started coming out in small groups, and then we saw Megan walking toward us in regular clothes, carrying a small bag of belongings. She looked different in civilian clothing, older and more serious, and when she reached us, she dropped the bag, and we all hugged in the parking lot for a long time, all of us crying. Other families glanced at us, but mostly gave us privacy, understanding the weight of these moments. The drive home was quiet but peaceful, Megan sitting in the back seat, watching the world pass by the window like she was seeing it for the first time. She commented on small things, trees and buildings and people walking dogs, ordinary sights that had been absent from her life for years. When we got to the house, Megan walked slowly through each room, touching furniture and walls like she needed to confirm everything was real. She stood in her bedroom doorway for a long moment before going inside, and when she sat on the bed and ran her hands over the soft comforter, she looked at us and said, "It felt like a dream to have privacy and space again." That first night home, we ordered pizza and watched a movie together on the couch. Megan sitting between Bonnie and me, and the simple normalcy of it made me realize how much I'd missed these ordinary moments of family life. 3 months after release, Megan started her job at the youth intervention nonprofit, and I drove her to work the first day because she didn't have a car yet. The organization operated out of a converted house in a neighborhood known for gang activity and poverty, and Megan's role was to meet with teenagers who had been referred by schools, courts, or concerned family members. Her supervisor was a former gang member who'd turned his life around and now dedicated himself to helping kids avoid the mistakes he'd made. Megan came home from her first week exhausted but energized, telling us stories about the kids she was working with and the challenges they faced. She described helping a 15-year-old girl recognize manipulation tactics being used by an online group that was recruiting her into white nationalist ideology, walking the girl through the same patterns of radicalization that Megan herself had experienced with animal rights extremism. The girl had started pulling away from the group after their conversations, and Megan said maybe she'd prevented another tragedy. Maybe one family wouldn't have to go through what we went through. Watching Megan find purpose in this work was powerful. Seeing her use her own painful experience to help others avoid similar paths. She worked long hours and took the responsibility seriously, never treating it as just a job, but as a genuine calling. Bonnie and I supported her however we could, driving her to work until she saved enough for a used car, listening when she needed to process difficult cases, reminding her to take care of herself when the emotional weight got too heavy. A year after Megan's release, we received an invitation that I never expected to see. Cooper's attorney forwarded it through our lawyer, a formal card inviting our family to attend Anya's annual memorial at the children's hospital where she'd worked. Cooper had been participating in restorative justice circles with us for the past several months, painful sessions where we all tried to find ways to live with what happened, and this invitation felt like an extension of that work. Bonnie was terrified to go, worried about causing more pain to Cooper and his daughters, but Megan said she needed to be there, needed to honor Anya's memory in whatever way Cooper would allow. We drove to the hospital on a Saturday morning, all of us dressed in dark clothes, and found the memorial service in a large conference room decorated with photos of Anya in her nurse's uniform. Nurses and families filled the room, people whose lives Anya had touched through her work with sick children, and we stood quietly in the back, listening to story after story about her kindness and dedication. Cooper spoke about Anya's love for her patients and her commitment to making scared kids feel safe during difficult treatments, and his voice only broke once when he mentioned how much the hospital staff still missed her presence. After the formal service ended, Cooper walked over to where we stood and asked if we wanted to meet his daughters. Megan said yes, and Cooper brought over 2 girls, now 9 and 12, who looked at us with curious but guarded expressions. Cooper introduced Megan as someone who had made a terrible mistake that took their mother away, but who was working hard to make sure other kids didn't make similar mistakes. The girls didn't say much, just nodded politely, but the older one asked Megan if she was sorry, and Megan knelt down and said she was sorry every single day and would be for the rest of her life. The moment was brief and painful, but also important. An acknowledgement that we all existed in the aftermath of tragedy and were trying to find ways forward. We left the hospital feeling heavy, but also strangely lighter, knowing that we'd faced the hardest truth together and survived it. We'll never be whole after what happened, and Anya's family will carry their loss forever, but we're all finding ways to live with the weight of tragedy while still moving forward. Megan is building a life focused on prevention and intervention, using her experience to reach kids before they make irreversible choices. Bonnie and I have grown stronger through surviving the impossible, learning that love can coexist with consequences and that families can endure even the worst circumstances. Nothing can undo the harm Megan caused or bring Anya back to her family, but we're creating meaning from the pain and helping others avoid similar devastation. That's not redemption exactly, but it's something, a way to honor Anya's memory by preventing future tragedies and supporting families through the aftermath of choices that can't be taken back.